Stats in a Wrap, the podcast series from Eurostat.
Heute Europa.
To może keby štatistiky
Un problema actualmente.
Contre les femmes, des violences.
myslím si, že existujú.
Erstmal mehr darüber sprechen.
Vale, pues yo creo.
Welcome to another episode of Stats in a Wrap, the podcast all about statistics from Eurostat, the statistical office of the European Union. If you've been listening to our podcasts, you'll know that we think data are not just appetizing, they're an essential nutrient. In fact, without official statistics, everyday life as we know it would grind to a halt. Sound stats are an essential cornerstone to democracy. And if you're a regular listener, you'll also know that there is no aspect of human life that statistics can't handle. But today, we're going to be talking about a very challenging aspect which relates to criminal justice. Some crimes are deeply hidden, and the data about them can be very hard to get. There's often little available physical evidence, sometimes no reliable witnesses. Victims can be too frightened to speak out. The crime we're talking about is gender-based violence against women. In May this year, the EU ratified a directive on violence against women and domestic violence, which obliges member states to pass legislation to stop it. Eurostat and the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the FRA, and the European Institute for Gender Equality, the EIGE, jointly conducted an EU gender-based violence survey which started in 2020 and concluded this year. The methodological manual for the survey, so just setting out how it's constructed and implemented, runs to nearly 700 pages. Fortunately, we have three experts with us today who can talk us through this vitally important project and the unique challenges it poses. Lisa Kolster is a former prosecutor. She's now part of the Violence Against Women team at the Gender Equality Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice and Consumers. Lisa, welcome.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Marta Adiego Estella is a technical advisor for Spain's Government Office Against Gender-Based Violence, and she works alongside Eurostat on the EU survey. Marta, welcome.
Good morning from Spain. Thank you for having me here.
Finally, from Eurostat, Merle Pats heads up the team conducting the survey itself. Merle, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Well, we're looking forward to understanding the statistical aspects of this vital area. But before we hear from our experts, let's step out of the Wrap Cafe for a moment and take a sounding from the street to get an idea of what the general public understand by the term gender-based violence.
Yeah, so I've heard obviously of gender-based violence, and I think it's just discrimination against other genders that maybe some people don't find standard, I would say, obviously.
I've experienced certain situations of sexual violence. Many of my friends have. I mean, I'm going to be honest, it's pretty common amongst almost every woman I meet. She'll either know somebody or herself have experienced it. Yeah, it's everywhere.
Violence can be many things. It can be physical violence, but it also can be psychological violence. It can be discrimination in the workplace, such as unbalanced gender, like the pay gap. It can be through, physical violence is the obvious one, I would say.
Can be verbal abuse or people being punched or beaten up or these kind of things.
Lisa, we heard a variety of interpretations and perspectives from members of the public just then. But what in law do we mean by gender-based violence? And where are the foundations of that term, GBV? Where does it come from?
Gender-based violence is a serious violation of human rights, and it's a form of discrimination that affects individuals based on their gender, or violence that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. There are several legal instruments defining this. One of the key conventions is the Istanbul Convention, as we call it, or more correctly, the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence.
In everyday language, the word violence relates for a lot of people to the use of physical force. But the law sees violence as not just related to the physical act. It can also occur online in the form of cyber violence. Lisa, can you just unpack that concept for us a little bit and how we define cyber violence?
I mean, the directive focuses on some of the most widespread forms of cyber violence. And those are the non-consensual sharing of intimate or manipulated material, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, and cyber incitement to violence or hatred.
I mean, that's a relatively recent development, I imagine, in terms of the definitions, because it's a product of how we use smartphones and social media, among other things.
I believe there probably are statistics about gender-based violence because it is such an important topic, and it's like you hear a lot about it, and it's like everybody has it in their mind, like it exists, everybody knows it, so people are interested in that topic. So I believe there should be a few of them.
There are definitely some statistics. I think they are doing a thorough research about the gender-based violence and violence against women. And also there were a lot of things, for example, during the discussion of Istanbul Convention. And so I guess they do have statistics. I mean, European Union is all about statistics.
Let's have a quick overview of the survey before we talk about the subject that the survey covers. Merle, just set out for us what we know from the survey and other surveys on violence against women and girls in the EU up to now. What is the available data and where does it come from?
Well, starting from the most serious statistics, we could assess that in average in the worldwide, there are more than 130 women or girls who are killed every day by someone in their own family. If you look at the police data in 2022, we can see that out of 100,000 women in the EU, around 60 reported that they were victims of sexual assault and close to 40 that they were victims of rape. And of course, this prevalence is much higher when we look at the population-based surveys, showing that 1 out of 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence during their lifetime.
It's important to remember here that we're not just looking at this for academic interest. It's something that's profoundly important about making society better and eliminating a particular kind of crime. Can you just tell us how the surveys work in tracking the effectiveness of GBV legislation?
Well, it's absolutely clear that to work on the topic, you need to understand the background. And to need to understand the background means to have a data. Gender-based violence is often hidden, even if it is serious sexual assault or if it is happening at home, in the place where every person should feel safe. It's also very well known that not all violence disclosed during the survey is reported to the police. And therefore, the survey results could complement the police statistics with a broader picture. However, it is also well known that all victims are not sharing violent experiences, what they have experienced, also during the survey. So we could conclude that even the survey might underestimate the real prevalence of gender-based violence.
So let's just go to the survey itself, which is so tricky because getting the data involves so much care.
The main purpose of EU gender-based violence survey is to assess prevalence of it. It also includes the information about frequency, intensity, and severity of experienced violence. And the questions are focusing on psychological violence by intimate partners, physical or sexual violence by intimate partner and any other person, sexual harassment at work, stalking, and violence experienced in childhood.
I think it could be a very tricky issue actually, because there might be also a lot of abuse and gender-based violence that we were just not aware of. Maybe if people are scared sharing their experience, or there could be a lot of victims that actually haven't been vocal about them suffering this kind of mistreatment. So I think there could be a lot of cases that we just don't know of that can't be included in these statistics.
I think it's a very sensitive matter, and people, and especially women, are afraid because they don't have any backup, any background. For example, with the officers, there is just not believing the victim many times. So I think the women are just afraid to speak up.
Merle, what are the challenges in designing a survey based on questions to women about violence and violence against them? I mean, this must be a very challenging prospect. So tell us about those challenges.
Yes, violence is not something that is openly discussed in society and also in all countries. Often, even closest persons don't know what is happening or what has happened with the person. It indeed requires very good preparation of this type of survey, starting, of course, from the questionnaire itself, but also selecting the most appropriate data collection method, and even more to train properly interviewers to prepare them carefully for asking this kind of sensitive questions and also coping with their own experiences, what they might have.
Now, we're going to Spain. Marta has been very patient listening to us. Let's just kick off with a little bit of a kind of overview. Just tell us about the national surveys you've conducted in Spain for the Spanish government for their use, but then you also work with Eurostat for the survey. So you've got two projects.
Well, in Spain, we have a lot of experience carrying out gender-based violence surveys. Since 1999 that we carried out the first one, we have been carrying them every 4 years, more or less. And the 4 first ones were only about intimate partner violence. But in 2015, we improved the survey and included non-partner violence. And after that, we got involved with the European project at the same time. And then we were there since 2017, working in the methodology, in the task force from Eurostat, trying to develop the European survey.
One of the problems with this kind of survey is that the respondents, the suppliers of the essential data, are themselves victims of crime, which is itself traumatic. Can you just unpack the challenges that this brings?
Well, it's difficult to carry out a survey like that because women sometimes doesn't want to talk about the violence they have suffered. They have many motives. They feel fear. They don't trust sometimes institutions. Sometimes they feel insane. Sometimes they think the police or even the interviewer is not going to believe them and doesn't want to pass for this process. And sometimes the problem is that even women doesn't recognize that they are living is violence. Then in the survey, you have to be very careful, try to create a very trusting environment, very well trained interviewers, try women to be confident and don't feel afraid of anything. And you have to be very careful too with the anonymity and the security of things in the survey. You have women to know that this information doesn't go anywhere than statistics, and her case is going to remain anonymous.
Absolutely. What I thought was interesting in your answer was that sometimes respondents don't recognise violence as violence. Threats, for example, husbands saying, oh, I'll take the children away, or, I'll report you to the police, or you'll get deported, things like that. That is violent behaviour, but some women might not see it like that. Do you have that problem in the survey?
Yeah. Sometimes it's that people think it is not violence. In the survey, we ask for acts, not talking about violence in any way, but even things that happens in the relationship that are violence, they don't recognize it like this. They think it's normal and they say, no, it's not so important to say yes to this question.
And I wanted to highlight that in domestic violence cases, this is a particular psychological survival mechanism that is called the normalization process. And that occurs in domestic violence cases when abuse becomes increasingly accepted or minimized over time. And this is the result of something that starts very subtly, and normally the perpetrator emotionally manipulate or control the victim. And then step by step, the person starts to control the victim more and more. And then the violence starts, maybe a little bit first, and then more and more and more. And throughout this process, the victim often loses self-esteem for sure, and then also contact with her support networks. And this makes it difficult for her to get out of this. And it creates a situation which is very hard to escape. I think here We as a society have an important role to play, to dare to ask questions about home conditions, to be attentive to warning signals, and to inform more broadly about helplines and awareness raising in general, which is also foreseen in the directive, which is something that member states have to do now.
It's important here to talk about police data and police information about gender-based violence. Can you just say what are the unique aspects of data about reported crimes and convictions, and particularly how the police themselves handle reports of GBV?
We know the figures of police reports underestimates violence, because when you compare them to calls to helplines for victims of gender-based violence, or if you compare with survey figures, you see clearly that they are underestimated.
One thing what we also need to take here into account, I think, is that reporting the violence to the police and sharing your story, what happened with you via survey, they are two different things. Starting already that the victim has to go to the police, taking into account all this harm what she might get through this investigation process. But regarding the survey, somebody is coming to victim either face-to-face or by online questionnaire and to ask to share what happened with you. So already from this perspective, it is totally different. So these data can really tell different stories and can complement each other.
That's important. I mean, there are two really interesting things here. One is that police data isn't necessarily useless data. It just works differently. It has different characteristics, and that's really important.
Yeah, police data doesn't give the whole picture.
But it gives a picture, yes, for sure, which might have some value if used.
I mean, the short answer is that we know based on studies that only a minor piece of violence that is occurring is actually reported. So if we would rely our policies on only reported cases, we would not cover the full picture with our policies. And we also know that the scale of gender-based violence continue to be largely invisible, and its nature is little understood. And as long as we don't know more about this, our policies will not be effective. So it's crucial that we get the full picture. We have to rely on police records, but we also need the survey to get the full picture and the correct data.
And then, sort of, what are the main reasons that you think women don't report their experiences? I mean, are there societal and cultural factors, or is it fear of further violence, or is it? Well, what are the reasons why women don't come forward when they could?
Actually, Jonathan, I think we more often need to revert that question and ask ourselves, how come that worldwide 130 men wake up every day and kill someone in their family? Well, if I should reply to your question on why women do not report, I think it has been mentioned here, it could be a lack of trust in institutions. There could be a fear of speaking about very intimate things with a complete stranger. It could also be that you're dependent on your partner for a residence status or financially. And then we also must understand that in many of these cases, the victim lives with the perpetrator. They might have children together. You know for a fact as a victim that this person have been violent to you before. And imagine going to the police and then later in the evening going to bed next to that person. Of course, there is a fear of your own safety. And that is also a reason why women do not report.
Merle, describe for us a little bit about how these surveys were conducted and the different techniques that were used, depending on the context.
Yes, the different data collection methods were allowed to be used with this survey, meaning that face-to-face interview, also interview via phone, and also web interview. And they all have their own pros and cons, of course, which were actually discussed in the methodological manual. But the country has to choose the best method for them. It was also allowed to combine different methods. In case you have the interviewer, then this person can actually convince respondent to provide responses and also provide support through full survey interviewing process, while it is definitely not so anonymous as it is, for example, online. In the online survey, respondent could find the best time for the responding, but there are not so many options how to get help if you want to know something more about the questions. In this survey, some countries who were using face-to-face interview, they still found the way how the most sensitive questions could be asked in this way that it was not necessary to ask and respond, meaning that, for example, they just gave the computer to the respondent and the respondent could fill it in by herself, this most sensitive part only, and then they continued with the normal face-to-face interview. So it gave really a lot of flexibility to the countries how to find the best way to conduct this data collection in their country.
Marta, tell us about the different techniques you've used and the strengths and weaknesses of each in the Spanish context.
We decided in 2015 to change to computer-assisted personal interviews because the use of trained interviewers, the responses is better. You can have a longer questionnaire without problems because by telephone it's very difficult to ask long questions and long questionnaire. And it was a very good improvement. But when we came to the European survey, we started to think that the technology was established in the society and the pandemic affected the way people communicate. And then we changed to a mixed mode between personal interviews and web interviews. And we have found that this way of doing the survey works for us better than only personal interviews, because it depends on the women what they prefer. Sometimes they don't want to see anybody at her home and they prefer to do it for themselves.
So I live in London and I hear about gender-based violence on a very regular basis, not only from friends, but friends of friends. A really strong example of when gender-based violence is at its peak in my hometown London is during football. Big football occasions. I'm so embarrassed by UK culture's football. I hate it. And the domestic violence statistics show that during big football events, when we lose, the domestic violence absolutely soars because men attack their women out of anger of not winning a stupid football game.
Lisa, I'm jumping about a bit here because I'm coming back to a point that we were talking about earlier, and I know that we do want to cover this. In some people's minds, it might be thought that being able to talk about women's lived experience at the hands of men has become easier to do because of the Me Too movement, for example. That was a seismic shift in the conversation about experiences in the workplace. It might lead people to think, well, okay, perhaps openness about violence might then be more expected in the current generation of younger women perhaps coming up. They feel more emboldened, they feel more supported, they feel more validated. Just unpack that from us from your point of view. You've observed this at close hand in a number of different prominent roles. Are we seeing greater openness? Is it likely that people are going to disclose more about violence, either in a survey context or in a administrative police context?
Yes, well, I think the Me Too movement was super important to raise awareness of the sexual harassment at work that so many women are facing worldwide. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the same openness about discussions concerning violence against women and domestic violence yet. Therefore, the directive pushes on the importance of awareness-raising campaigns in this area. It obliges states to act to prevent this kind of violence from happening and to inform its citizens about it through educational programs to basically increase understanding among the general public of the different manifestations of this kind of violence. And I think that's super important because as citizens, we need to act and to know about this violence. We need to act if we hear noise from our neighbor, which we think could be the noise of domestic violence. We need to ask our sisters, our mothers, our friends, if we can see that they have bruises or think that they are starting to be more and more controlled by their partners and so on. It's very important to raise awareness of the specificities of these kind of crimes of violence against women and domestic violence. That's why it's so important to have data on this, because when people understand that it's actually a third of our mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends that are experiencing this, people understand that we are failing as a society and that we need to act to tackle this.
Well, I guess the gender-based violence statistics are useful, for acting on them, trying to work out which type of violences are on the increase.
Statistics can be really helpful for us. People like facts, people like clear evidence, and people like to see things visually and they can understand what it is that's going on in the world, then they can actually feel more connected to it and therefore would want to change it. Whereas if you just say there is gender-based violence, people go, yes, but how and what? I'm not actually able to digest that because I haven't got any reference point as to how it affects me or how it affects the world that I live in.
We're coming to the end of the podcast now. I just want to go to Merle once more. People listening to this will want to know how they can access information from the survey and what they can use today and what will be coming up in the future. Just tell us a little bit about what the outputs of the survey are that are available currently and what is in prospect.
The survey data, as much as we have now, are already disseminated in Eurostat database, but there will be the joint dissemination event on 25th of November this year, where we actually make publicly available EU-wide data. And then we, of course, hope that we have many researchers working with them and showing different angles out of this data. Lisa already highlighted the need for the data also in the future. Eurostat has already started together with the member states to prepare the next wave of this survey. The next wave will be also voluntary, and we also hope that one day we will have the statistical regulation in place to make this survey as a compulsory for all EU member states. And as an end of that, we will have the regular data, maybe after each 5 years for full EU.
Well, let's hope that comes sooner rather than later. We are very late for sure, but securely on this vital path of research. And I hope we'll have a chance to come back to the subject again soon on Stats in a Wrap. It feels as if we've only scratched the surface of the subject today, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. So it only remains for me to say thank you to our panellists, to the three experts that we've had today. Merle Leppartz from Eurostat, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it is really interesting discussion.
It was indeed. Thank you so much. Marta Adiego in Spain, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the experience. It has been very good experience.
And Lisa Kost from the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice and Consumers, thank you so much for giving us your perspective in the podcast today.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure to be here.
It was a pleasure to have you all. Thank you very much. If you've enjoyed Stats in a Wrap, don't forget to follow us on social media and share our adventures with friends and colleagues, where the show can be found on Spotify, Apple, and all the usual places. And if you'd like to know more about the topics covered in this podcast and practically every aspect of statistics in the EU, you should make your way to Eurostat's amazing educational resource, Statistics Explained, which is packed with infographics, videos, and explainers of all kinds. It's really worth checking out. And of course, do join us for the next edition, when we'll be dishing up more flavoursome insights from Eurostat, this time about rural Europe. If you've ever wanted to understand the pros and cons of living in the countryside versus the city, join us for that one. You may be in for some interesting surprises. But for now, goodbye.